Welcome everyone to the Deploy Securely podcast, where we go deep on the security, compliance, and privacy implications of using AI. I'm your host, Walter Haydock, founder and CEO of StackAware. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Sullivan. Patrick is the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at A-LIGN, a cybersecurity assurance firm. He's an expert on the intersection of AI and compliance, regularly sharing expert insights about ISO 42001, the EU AI Act, and their interplay with existing regulations and best practices. He's also been kind enough to have me on his own podcast, The Business of Compliance, which I definitely recommend to our audience. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Walter. Grateful to be here, man. Really am.
Awesome. So could you just start us off by talking a little bit about A-LIGN and its mission?
Sure, would love to. So, as you mentioned, A-LIGN is a cybersecurity and assurance firm. So, we primarily focus on, from an assurance perspective, third-party compliance. We began cutting our teeth well over a decade ago on SOC 2 examinations, SOC 2 attestations. But we've since grown our book of business, our body of work to include ISO certification work. So we are an ISO CB certification body. We perform PCI assessments. We're a QSA company, a QSAC. We do high trust assessments. We do FedRAMP authorization. To those directors at A-LIGN that are listening, if I've forgotten your practice, I apologize. The point being, we really cover the entire gamut of third-party assurance services. And from a cybersecurity perspective, we are very, very proud of our research lab and our penetration testing services. Those have really shown themselves to be of value in helping organizations understand where their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses really are. We are a multinational, and I think I'm making this take a little bit longer than you intended. I apologize, Walter. We're multinational. We've got offices, of course, domestically here in the States, Panama, Bulgaria, India. We have an office in Ireland now to help us cover some of the need that we see in the UK and the EU. Our mission is to provide value. That really and truly is it. I'd seen this definition of partnership many years ago, that partnership is creating value via shared resources, some of my resources, some of your resources. And really and truly, though it sounds altruistic, it is our mission to help our customers, those that choose to partner with us, create value through their cybersecurity and compliance programs. So I love it. I absolutely love what we do.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah, of
thanks for that overview.
course.
So drilling down into the topic of today's discussion, I'd love to hear some of your insights from what you've seen helping your customers navigate AI governance and assurance issues. So
Yes.
happy to drill down into specific topics, but at a high level, I'll turn it back to you and love to hear your high level observations.
Yeah, and Walter, and I think you very likely see this as well with your customers, but largely the questions I get are, where do I start? I think there's an element of FUD, of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the market right now. And though technical people in organizations tend to have an understanding of what might be going on, those same technical people don't always care about value creation, don't always really care about governance that's necessary from an executive perspective. And so I really see this disconnect in drivers inside organizations, wherein leaders feel like maybe they need to be doing something, but they don't necessarily know what that thing is. All that to say, FUD is really a big thing in the market right now. We see some hubris as well, quite frankly. We see organizations that think that they're doing everything well when they approach us, and I have conversations with them about what it might look like to pursue certification for ISO 42001. For those that are unaware, it's the international standard that allows you to certify your AI management system, for your governance infrastructure for AI. As these organizations come in, some have just flatly not been ready. And it's a real eye opener because they just don't know what they don't know. I don't know if your experience is the same.
Yeah, certainly when you're going through a structured process like an ISO 42001 preparation and then certification process, there are lots of potential gotchas, I think, that
Yeah.
if you're just not used to it, if you haven't gone through that type of assessment before, you can easily get hung up with. So definitely agree with you there. In terms of, for those who might be joining, can you talk about some of the drivers for getting ISO 42001 certification, what that might look like from a business perspective?
Of course, and really in my mind today, and this is my own opinion, in my mind today, I really see two big drivers. One in market pressure and one in regulatory pressure. And of those two, market pressure is, in my mind, by far leading what's driving organizations to think about what they need to do from a governance perspective. There are a lot of ill-defined terms in the community right now. One of the biggest is responsible AI. More and more companies and executives are recognizing that they need to be responsible with how they develop and deploy AI systems, and their customers are telling them. First, it was a whisper. Now we start to hear things more and more loudly and more regularly. Uh, but yet, yes, yeah, I think lack of ambiguity, lack of clarity around what it means to really govern has been a significant driver. While we don't necessarily see a ton of contractual requirements yet, I do expect those to start coming in, particularly as we do see regulation pick up. From a regulatory perspective, I think those of us that are operating in the EU are probably well aware of the EU AI Act and the fact that it is effectively live now, though there is a little bit of a ramp up period. In the States, we have a little bit different tact on this, that there is no national or federal regulation. There likely will be. There's actually a group working to ensure that we have something we can stand behind. But what we see are state by state kind of piecemeal regulations coming online that appear to have varying degrees of effectiveness, varying degrees of focus, and really and truly varying degrees of ability to monitor and hold organizations accountable. So while regulation is a pressure, it's one of the unknowns that I think some organizations are feeling by far. In my mind, it's the market that's driving where companies are going as it relates to actually building these AI governance systems today. And Walter, I don't know if you're saying a similar thing with your customers.
Yeah, yeah. So something that I know you're aware of, but our audience may not be, is that Microsoft recently announced as part of its supplier
Yes.
security and privacy assessment program, they were going to be requiring all suppliers who provide AI services to have some sort of external attestation or assurance report. And then for a specific set of them, specifically those involved in healthcare or predictive maintenance, they would require ISO 42001 certification from that subset of suppliers. So definitely already seeing some market pressure for ISO 42001, and I think we can continue to see that evolve as, like you said, organizations are just becoming aware of how important AI governance is throughout their supply chain. So I think we're going to
Yeah.
see companies start demanding it from their vendors.
Yeah, particularly from their vendors. We've talked about third-party risk management. I mean, these days it really does become a fourth and fifth party risk management in so many ways, as best we can reach down that chain. But back to the SSPA program, to your point, this will be a fundamentally different thing for the market, those that have participated with Microsoft in the past. Microsoft has traditionally allowed for excusal, whatever the right word is, of the SSPA audit if organizations have carried ISO 27001 and 27701. So they've got good security, good privacy practices that they can certify and offer to Microsoft. The fact that we're seeing this shift toward focusing exclusively within the SSPA assessment, a section is exclusively devoted to assessing the AI environment, and then even AI red teaming, which I don't know if you caught this as you read through the standard. I think this is just going to be a fundamentally different thing for many organizations. And what I think is so telling is that Microsoft, as a vendor, as a provider, really will set the tone for other providers around the world. So, in many ways, this really does, in my mind, become one of the first dominoes that pushes things toward organizations having to have some sort of AI assurance program, some sort of AI governance program to continue to do business. So the regulation isn't in place, that market pressure, that peer pressure, I really do think is going to drive folks forward sooner rather than later, and perhaps before they're ready to move forward.
Yep.
Yep.
Agree with you there. So on the regulatory side, something that I'd ask you to talk about is, I get questions from customers about certain regulations like, hey, if I'm ISO 42001 certified, am I good with this regulation? Now, some regulations like SB 205 in Colorado specifically
Mhm.
name ISO 42001 as a standard with which, if you are in compliance with it, although they don't exactly define what in compliance means,
They don't.
if you were in compliance with it, it can give you safe harbor under certain circumstances. But not every AI regulation is specifically calling out ISO 42001. With that said, can you talk about the value of pursuing that certification, even if legislation doesn't specifically identify it as giving you safe harbor?
Oh, absolutely. And really, in my mind, the value in the certification, secondary value exists in defending against regulatory pressure. There's no question. But in my mind, the real value of standing up an AIMS, an AI management system, following ISO 42001's prescription, is that it forces organizations to think about what they're doing in context of the organization itself, which I think is something that most organizations, though we have a lot of really, really intelligent people running businesses, those really, really intelligent people don't always stop to critically think about what it is that they're really doing. And so, though 42001 is a management system by definition, what we'll see is that in 42001, there are a number of processes, a number of commitments that tie directly to governance or value creation inside the organization. ISACA says governance is really three core processes: evaluate, direct, and monitor. So we evaluate against a known good standard, we direct or we set priority about what the organization should focus on, and then we monitor. We continually look, we provide feedback, and we take corrective action when necessary. The Deming loop: plan, do, check, act. Those three core processes are built directly into the clauses of ISO 42001. So in many ways, the value for orgs is creating a system wherein they force themselves, where leaders force themselves to step back out of the fray and think about what it is they really want to create. And in that context, in the context of what they're doing and what serves their business, they have an opportunity to optimize risk, not minimize risk, not get risk to go away, but to optimize risk to something that they can accept as they go about their mission. And so it's huge in my mind. It is absolutely huge. Now, secondarily, with the regulatory pressure, and Walter, this is my opinion again, but I think as we do see federal things come online, as we do see more states stand up their own regulation, I think it would be crazy for them to start over from scratch and develop their own framework. Just like we're saying with some of the things going on with Sensenelec overseas as they decide what the conformance standard for the AI Act will be. With 42001, we have a known good international standard, a solid standard that was intended to be extensible. It's intended to be bolted onto a compartment. It's intended to do what it does in a way that can be expanded to meet the needs in the specific context of the organization. I really do see that spirit being brought forth through whatever it is we see coming next. Colorado set the stage, but other states that come online absolutely have to see the value in 42001 or the NIST AI risk management framework, which supplements and complements 42001 very, very well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that the process side of things is where ISO 42001 delivers the most value for organizations. It gives you a way to interpret
Mhm.
regulatory guidance, match it against your business objectives, and then assess and manage the risk appropriately. So,
Yes,
definitely agree with you there. Now, moving on to more of the kind of technical or applied side of things,
yes.
what are the biggest risks on your radar when it comes to your clients and how they're using AI?
Yeah, so I think first is denial. I think we still see organizations that are saying, well, we're not using AI. We've sent an email that tells our employees they can't use it, so we're not. So I think leaders themselves are a significant risk today, quite frankly. A layer down from that, we do see organizations begin to think about AI specific risk, but they don't take the time to think about AI specific risk in context of their own organization. And so, what I've seen, I don't know if you've experienced this, Walter, is we'll see some risk ledgers that essentially are brainstorming activities that they have no real connection, no practical connection back to the organization itself. And so, when we end up in that situation, we begin controlling risk that doesn't really exist, which is highly, highly problematic. And, I think those are the two biggest things: lack of context and then just pure denial. Beyond that, change. We see, I see, and that is people slowly embracing what has become the chat GPTs, the traditional, and it's funny to call it traditional, but the interaction between a human and an LLM through some sort of chat bot. People are slowly embracing that this is what it is. I don't think that most organizations are prepared for what's coming next. There's significant talk about the benefit of agentic AI now and what that will look like. I just worry that organizations will be flexible enough in their thinking to really prepare to continue to adapt at the speed that they're going to need to adapt at. So maybe limited thinking would be the third biggest risk that I'm seeing right now. I know those aren't necessarily technical risks, but they're risks just the same.
Definitely good points. I would say on the first part about, well, there's denial, but also there are a lot of information gaps out there. I know going through Stacker's own ISO 42001 certification process that we had to say a known gap is this vendor
Yes.
is not very clear about how its AI processing works. It's not clear about its architecture. We've reached out to them. I run a small company. I can't exactly force them to, cough up their technical diagrams and things like that. So, in some cases we needed to accept the risk of, unclear AI processing. We did that in cases where it was only using public data or something like that, where, frankly, we expected the information to become public. So, how
Yes.
they're processing it isn't that concerning. But, there are a lot of situations like that where there is some opacity, some lack of transparency, which I think can make risk management difficult, certainly. And then on the second piece on agentic AI, I think that's something that I think security teams especially are going to have a lot of trouble handling that and thinking about it because you can't expect the system to behave the same way every time, even given the same inputs. It's not deterministic when you have LLMs or some sort of AI system that is communicating with other systems, especially if they're communicating with other non-deterministic systems. Things can potentially spiral pretty quickly. At the same time, there's huge opportunity, huge potential for value delivery
Yes.
with autonomous systems. So I think having the right framework in place to measure and manage the risk is what is the right approach, in my opinion. In my
Oh,
opinion.
I totally agree. Totally agree. And I think that all begins with a governance system that leadership can commit to and ensure that everyone in the organization understands their role. Again, back to the value of 42001. You mentioned uh, people struggling with agentic AI, and we struggle with humans that exercise their own agency. And imagine when this stuff is just going on in the background and you really have no sense of why you're generating the outcomes that you're generating. I mean, that really is the future that we're looking at soon.
Yeah, one of my former managers who he kind of grew up as a developer, he said, one of the problems with humans is that they don't do exactly what you tell them to do, whereas computers, they do. Unfortunately, that's going to change. That's going to
Yes.
change. I told the computer to execute this function 10 years ago, there'd be no question that if you had certain inputs, you would get certain outputs. But now there will be a question, and there'll be benefits and risks of that happening.
And the cool thing is, so in systems thinking, I don't know if you've ever read any of Peter Senge's work. He wrote an absolutely incredible book called The Fifth Discipline. But regardless, the idea with complex systems is that there will always be emergent properties, that things will necessarily be an output of the system that we never considered, we never theorized would be a possibility. And the reality is, with agentic AI and other forms of machine learning, we really are on the eve of having to deal with emergent properties that we just never considered, which I think is an important thing. What are we really creating? What are we really preparing ourselves to need to be prepared for without a good understanding today? And those are things that we really have to start wrapping our minds around. And again, not to plug 42001, but therein lies the value of a structure that we can return to and actually feel comfortable in knowing that regardless of what happens, we have a solid understanding of how to begin addressing and how to move forward when the time is right.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So we've talked about some of the risks, how to mitigate them. If you were, I mean, obviously you are an advisor in some circumstances, but also a third party assessor. If you were to advise your clients, if there were one thing that would be the highest ROI action that they could take across their entire business, again, assuming a generic customer of yours, what would that be?
And Walter, it comes back to context. I mean, this is the area that it continues to baffle me that we as organizations forget that we need to do, and that's to step back and think about our organization and its overall context. What are we really trying to accomplish? What is it as an organization we're trying to create? And where do we sit in our ecosystem? So many companies, so many organizations today skip this step and begin making plans to do other things, particularly around controlling risk without an understanding of your context. You're controlling risks that might or might not be applicable and wasting time, money, and resources that could otherwise be spent actually helping you grow and create more value for your shareholders. So, determining context, determining who we are and what it is we want to create, in my mind, is the biggest thing and probably the least technical thing organizations can be doing, which is why it's so critical. Everyone can do it. It doesn't require a subject matter expert.
Yeah, I think the question of what are we doing here,
What are we
folks?
doing here?
That
Yeah.
that that is something that is quite simple, but often not asked. And certainly, I've seen in my experience, I've seen even security teams chasing their tails on kind of trivial risks, expending resources when, I mean, most likely that could just be dedicated to a higher priority or a higher likelihood or impact risk, or
Right.
from a broader business sense, you could take those resources and dedicate them to value delivery. So not delivering to your customers is a risk. The most secure system in the world is something that you encase in concrete and drop to the bottom of the ocean, but no one's going to use it and it's not going to earn you any money and it's not going
No
to help
value
anyone.
whatsoever. Yes. Yeah, but again, to your point, it's really hard to in fact, it's impossible to prioritize appropriately if you don't understand what your priorities are. And your priorities are determined primarily by the context. That's it. To your
Yep.
point, what are we really trying to do here? Often missed.
Unfortunately. So you
Yes.
mentioned you mentioned FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt earlier in the
I did.
conversation. And I'm interested in what you think is the top or the top three myths about AI governance and security that you've encountered out in the marketplace.
Um, so probably the biggest, and I'm sure you deal with this as well, is that governance is a one-time exercise. We create a policy and we're done. We're never to revisit again. People just know that this is how we behave and what our expectations are. That is absolutely a myth. Governance is really about culture change. And when you consider that culture is the relationship of the people to the organization, as we do change the expectation of the organization, we also have to help bring along our people. And so necessarily our culture has to change to support this new vision that we have. Um, so the myth number one would be that it's easy. I create a policy and we're done. That will never work in production unless you're a solopreneur. And then frankly, then you're still going to have issues too, because we very seldom do what we know that we should be doing. Um, Myth number two might be that governance is security. And I think this is probably a conversation you have quite a bit. Fundamentally different things. And, I have this conversation a lot with organizations around 42001, that they'll call it a security standard. And I want to be very particular and very specific in the language here because while there are hints of security things in the standard, as an example, risk. The risk is, really a consequence of vulnerabilities and threats. And so to that end, we can bring in some traditional security concepts. Governance is a fundamentally different thing. It's about creating value. Really hard stop. It's about ensuring that we're doing the right things to create responsible and reproducible systems that limit impact and harms to those that are using our systems. And so, secondarily, we'll see some security concepts rolled in. But governance is not necessarily about security, though security helps feed and inform governance. Um, yeah, and Walter, maybe I'll leave it at those two things because those are really the kind of two broadest areas that we don't have to, but we choose to help educate our prospects and customers on.
Yeah, definitely a good point on the first one. Certainly interested in your experiences with customers. What percentage or what fraction are you seeing of companies that you work with implementing things like compliance as code or automating compliance processes to prevent the kind of one and done approach to governance that you warned about?
Yeah, and for the developers that we work with, I'll say, and this is purely gut, but 50-50. We see some real exemplars of using compliance as code or other security techniques in the development process. People really standing up SEC SDLCs in a meaningful way. And then we see others that are organizations that have just kind of grown from a little development shop that are doing things the way that they've always done it, which is as easy as possible, but in a repeatable way as possible. That just have a long way to go to prepare themselves to really have a healthy and mature environment. Yeah, what
Got
about you, man? I'm interested in your take on this.
Yeah, I would say that it's probably less than 50-50. I'd say of probably 10% of organizations that I have worked with have some sort of repeatable, automated compliance processes. Now, that's not to
Mm.
say they don't have effective processes.
Yes,
I
yes.
actually happen to have the pleasure of working with some of the more advanced and sophisticated ones, but even among those, the ones that have truly automated compliance and security processes is relatively low. I'm seeing it increase over time. It's kind of one of those things where, I keep hearing about compliance as code everywhere I go, and I see
Uh,
all these great blog posts on it. And then, I get into, even in my own organization where I'm automating as much as possible, there still is a manual burden. So, it's kind of like, the Moby Dick out there is that white whale of compliance as code. That's what I've experienced. Although I'm certainly a fan of that approach and definitely aspire to that and try to help my customers get to that level.
yeah, and I'd love to connect you with some people so you can kind of see what others are doing out there. I
Awesome.
think it'd be worth your while, man. I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So as we head toward the conclusion, are there any folks that you find especially insightful in the space when it comes to AI governance that you would recommend folks follow or listen to?
Yes, yeah. And so you and I were kind of talking about this before we kicked off the call. So, and those listeners on the podcast today are likely well aware of this. So, there appear to be a couple of different camps in the AI governance space today. There appear to be scholars and researchers that are producing a lot of really, really cool content. And then there are professionals, people like you, that are actually doing this stuff. And so while I follow both groups just so I can understand what the possibilities are and then what's really happening, I tend to prefer to follow you. You're one of my big reads for what it's worth, Walter. So thank you for everything that you're doing. Shay Brown with Babel AI. Those of you that are not familiar with Shay, look him up. Babel is doing amazing things. They have set the standard for algorithm audit. If that's not a concept that's familiar to you, find out. It is worth your while. It really will be the next wave of how we think about AI governance and responsible AI use. Megan Manival writes a blog called The Risk Optimist.
Stackaware
Megan,
advisor, by the way. Sorry to
oh,
interrupt.
that's right. That's right. I forgot. Yeah. Megan is absolutely amazing. An absolute pro. She's been deeply connected with ISACA for years. Her perspective on risk and AI risk and governance is unique and needed in the market and field. But Walter, I'll limit it to that core group, but there are so many great people. A guy named Tristan Roth, I've only recently become familiar with, is doing some amazing things as it relates to thinking about management systems and cross mappings and how to really bring value, how to really bring leverage to building management systems and governance systems that can support organizations. So a lot of really, really cool things happening in the community. But yeah, and it all starts with you, man, for what it's worth. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you. I will shamelessly plug again that Tristan is a Stackware customer. So
Oh, I did not know that. I did not know that. Yeah.
yes, we
Yeah.
did a pen test for one of his applications. So great to hear. Great to hear that we've got some well-regarded minds
And you do.
in our network. In our
And you
network.
do.
Yeah. Yeah. On
Yeah.
the kind of applied versus theoretical side of things, I certainly agree. I know MIT put out this great database that had like, 700 to 1,000 AI related risks. I actually poured over that because Stackaware maintains a list of AI risks. But, what I did is I basically condensed that down into, about 15 items to add to my database, that I've kind of, mush things together and kind of consolidated because it's great to have a database of 1,000 risks for people who are like you and me who think about this every day. But if you hand
Mhm.
that to someone who this is 10% of his job, that's going to be a difficult thing to pour over.
No,
Certainly.
no, drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe
Yep.
1% makes it in.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Awesome. So, last thing to ask would be, is there anything you'd like to plug? So, your podcast, which I'll plug your podcast. Any other blogs, podcasts, your company certainly is fair
Yeah, I
game.
mean, I do want to be sure to mention A-LIGN again. And Walter, kind of my vision on this, and I think you share a similar vision, but just for those listening that are not intimately familiar with compliance and the compliance ecosystem today, that there are a few key players that companies need in order to be successful. And these are different partners, if you will. So there are the assessment partners, the certification bodies in the context of ISO, assessment partner in every other context. Organizations like A-LIGN, we have our role. We do what we do, I believe, very, very well and bring a ton of value to organizations that have an understanding of how to create value through their compliance programs. But in order to maintain a level of objectivity, we're limited in the advice that we can give in some cases, particularly around ISO certifications. In those instances, we have to lean on another partner, which are our advisory or readiness partners. And this is where groups like StackAware shine, where groups like Babel shine. They're able to step in and help a customer make decisions in context of the organization, again, which is so critical to really build systems that we can then come in and certify. And so the relationship between these two organizations is just so critical for the best interest of the customer. Again, if partnership is creating value via shared resources, suddenly we have this group of resources that have to work intimately and have to trust one another for that matter to create value for the customer in a way that creates value for the entire value chain that the customer is operating within. And then thirdly, we see GRC partners. We see these compliance automation platforms like Vanta, like Drata. I think at one point StackAware was even going this direction, Walter. But we see those organizations playing a role as well for companies that don't yet know how to prepare themselves to undergo an audit or how to maintain their ISMS or how to provide assurance documentation to their customers. And so if you're sitting out there and you're on the eve of beginning this process, please know it takes a village. There is not one single entity that you're going to go to that's going to help get you over the hump. And if you hear that they can, you really need to be suspect and think about what it is that you're hearing and what it is that you're committing to, because it takes lots of expertise and it takes, again, lots of trust and partnership to create the outcomes that we want to create for our customers. So I guess that would be my shameless plug. Work with partners, trust your partners, be honest. And if you don't know where to start, reach out. reach out to me, reach out to Walter. We'll absolutely put you on the right track.
100%. And thanks for summarizing the triumvirate there.
Yes.
Stackware, yeah, was looking at going into the GRC platform space, but we're not playing there anymore. We're mainly partnering with those folks and supporting them from a data provider and expertise provider perspective. So
Yes.
yeah, great summary. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on the show. Always appreciate our conversations. They're always in depth, very detailed, no fluff. And yeah, look forward to staying in touch, seeing your great content on LinkedIn and other media. And for everyone else, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, I'm Walter Hidock, and this is the Deploy Securely podcast.